Siren had not planned on making the floor glow. She had planned on delivering a tincture to Counselor Harwick, applying the compress to his swollen knee and leaving the great hall before anyone important noticed she existed. That was the plan. Simple plans, in her experience, were the only kind that worked for people like her. People who were invisible on purpose. But the floor had other ideas. The cracks had been spreading for weeks now. Everyone in Valdres had seen them. Long, jagged fractures running through the ancient stone of the castle like veins of rot, widening every day, swallowing mortar and splitting tiles that had stood unbroken for 8 centuries. The walls wept moisture that smelled of decay. The banners hung limp, as though the air itself had lost the will to move. The rivers ran slower, the crops yellowed at the root, and no one could explain why. And now, as Siren crossed the great hall with her herb basket and her head down, and her heart carefully locked behind every wall she had ever built, the cracks were closing, not slowly, not subtly. The stone beneath her feet was knitting itself together with a faint, golden shimmer that spread outward from each step like ripples in still water. Mortar reformed between tiles. The fractures sealed with a sound like a long breath being released. Warmth radiated up through her thin shoes and into her bones, and she did not understand it, and she could not stop it, and every single person in the great hall had stopped breathing. Siren froze. The herb basket slipped in her grip. A sprig of dried lavender tumbled out and hit the glowing floor, and she watched it put out a tiny green shoot on contact. A dead sprig, putting out a shoot on stone. This is not happening, she thought. I am having a very specific kind of nervous collapse and none of this is real. But the warmth beneath her shoes said otherwise, and so did every face in the hall. Counselor Harwick's mouth hung open, mid-complaint, his swollen knee entirely forgotten. 2 guards near the entrance had drawn their swords out of what appeared to be sheer confusion, because apparently the appropriate response to a glowing floor was violence. A serving girl clutched a wine pitcher against her chest like it was the only real thing left in the world. An elderly scribe at the far table had removed his spectacles, cleaned them on his sleeve, replaced them, and was now staring at Siren with the expression of a man who had just been personally betrayed by reality. And at the head of the hall, seated on the throne of Valdres with his chosen mate beside him, King Theron Ashvale was looking directly at her. For the first time in 3 months, his eyes were on her face, and Siren wanted to die. Not dramatically, not romantically. She simply wanted the freshly healed floor to crack open one more time and swallow her whole, because this was the man who had stood before the entire kingdom at the autumnal choosing, looked straight through her as if she were made of smoke, and placed his hand on another woman's shoulder instead. And Siren had felt the bonds snap into place that night, felt it lock around her ribs like iron bands, felt the tether stretch from her chest toward his with desperate, aching certainty. He had kept walking. That was the part she could not stop replaying, not the rejection itself, but the walking. The easy, unhesitating stride of a man who had felt nothing at all. Siren had been left on the castle steps as an infant, wrapped in a wool blanket with no note, no name, no explanation. Marin, the kingdom's head healer, had taken her in and raised her alongside the apprentice healers. When it became clear that Siren's talents lay not in treating people, but in nurturing growing things, Marin had given her a purpose in the seed vault beneath the castle. Plants thrived under her hands. Seeds that should have been dead for decades germinated when she touched them. She had a gift, everyone agreed. But a small one, a quiet one. Nothing that would make a king look twice. The autumnal choosing happened once a generation. When an alpha king reached bonding age, eligible wolves from across the kingdom were presented at court. The bond was supposed to be recognized, that primal pull that declared one person as the alpha's fated mate. Everyone knew the stories. Everyone believed Siren had not wanted to attend. She was not noble, She was not beautiful in the way that mattered at court, the kind that announced itself across a room and demanded attention. Her beauty, if it existed at all, was the kind you had to stand very close to notice, and no one ever stood that close. But attendance was mandatory for all unmated wolves of age. So she had stood in the back of the hall in her best dress, which was also her only dress, and prayed that the evening would end without anyone learning her name. Theron had entered the hall, and her world had ended. The bond hit her like a fist to the chest. Every nerve screamed that he was hers. And when his gaze passed over her without pause, without recognition, without the smallest flicker of acknowledgement, she had felt the tether snap taut and find nothing on the other end. He chose Lady Vesna Ashbourne, the daughter of the Southern Alpha, a political alliance to unite the border territories and strengthen the kingdom's most vulnerable flank. The court had cheered. Saren had fled before the applause died. She spent 3 nights curled on her cot in the seed vault beneath the castle, pressing her face into her pillow so that no one would hear the sounds she made. And then she had gotten up, washed her face, gone back to work, and pretended that the hollow ache in her chest was something she could learn to live with. Now, she was standing in his hall with golden light pooling at her feet, and every eye in the room locked on her, and the king staring at her like she was a problem he did not know how to solve. Don't move. The voice belonged to Corvin, the king's beta, who had risen from his seat beside the throne. His face was carefully blank, but his eyes were sharp, cataloging, measuring. Saren did not move. She barely breathed. The golden light continued spreading, and she watched in helpless horror as a crack 4 feet from her left ankle sealed itself shut. With a faint sigh, "I didn't do anything," Saren whispered. Her voice came out thin and frightened. "I was just walking. I was bringing Counselor Harwick his knee compress. I didn't mean to." She looked down at the floor. The glow was fading now, but the cracks remained sealed, healed, warm beneath her shoes. Corvin knelt and pressed his palm flat against the stone where the largest fracture had been. His eyebrows rose. "Warm," he said quietly. "The stone is warm." He looked up at Saren, then back at the king. Something passed between the two men, a silent understanding that made Saren's stomach drop to her shoes. "Miss Saren," Corvin said, rising, "I need you to remain in the castle tonight. Don't leave the grounds." "Am I in trouble?" Saren asked, because that seemed like the kind of thing a person should know. "No," Corvin said. But he did not explain further, and the pause that followed felt enormous. "I'll send for you in the morning." Saren clutched her basket to her chest with white-knuckled hands and risked one more glance toward the throne. Theron's jaw was tight. His gray eyes held hers for exactly 1 second, and in that second, she felt the bond in her chest flare with such desperate heat that she nearly gasped. Then he looked away. Beside him, Lady Vesna leaned back in her seat. Her expression had not changed, but her fingers had curled around the arm of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Saren turned and walked out of the hall on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She made it to the corridor before the shaking started. The room they brought her to the next morning was deep inside the east wing, a part of the castle she had never entered. It smelled like old parchment and cold stone, and the particular variety of dread that came from knowing your life was about to change in ways you had no power to stop. Saren sat on a wooden bench and pressed her hands flat against her thighs. She had been here since dawn. No one had come. No one had explained. She kept replaying the moment in the great hall, the golden light spreading from her feet, the sealed cracks, Theron's face unreadable and fixed on hers for 1 shattering second before he looked away. What if they think I did something to the castle? The thought circled her mind like a bird in a cage. What if they think I'm dangerous? What if they think I was trying to get his attention? As if I would ever, as if glowing at a man who rejected me in front of the entire kingdom was a strategy anyone would choose on purpose. The door opened. Corvin entered, followed by Marin. Saren nearly wept with relief at the sight of her mentor. The old healer's white hair was pinned back in its usual severe knot. Her face was calm, but her eyes were bright, the way they got when she was pursuing a question that fascinated her. "Saren," Corvin said. "Thank you for waiting." "You're welcome," Saren said, then immediately wished she hadn't, because thanking someone for waiting when you had given them no choice felt like a very specific kind of cruelty. "What is happening?" Corvin glanced at Marin, who gave a small nod. "We'd like to try something," Corvin said. "An experiment. An experiment," Saren repeated. "On me? With you," Marin corrected gently. They led her out through a side door and into the castle gardens. And Saren's breath caught. She had not been to the upper gardens in weeks. The last time she had walked through them, they had been tired, but living their beds thinning with early autumn. Now they were ruined. The rose bushes had gone black at the root. The ancient yew hedges that lined the gravel paths were shedding needles in brittle sheets. Even the moss on the fountain had turned gray, dry and papery and dead. It looked like something had reached into the soil and pulled the life out by the roots. "Walk," Corvin said simply. Saren stared at him. "Just walk through the garden, at your usual pace. Touch whatever you would normally touch." Saren looked at Marin, who gave her an encouraging nod but offered nothing else. So Saren walked. For the first 30 seconds, nothing happened. She moved along the gravel path, acutely aware of Corvin and Marin watching from the gate, acutely aware of the devastation around her, acutely aware that she probably looked ridiculous. A small, dirt-fingered woman, strolling through a dead garden, like she was out for a pleasant morning wander. Then she brushed her hand against a blackened rosebush. As she passed it, the branch flushed green beneath her fingers. Color bled through the dead wood like ink spreading through water, racing down the stem and into the roots and up through every thorn and leaf buds appeared, swelled and opened into full crimson blooms in the span of a single breath. Saren yanked her hand back and stared. "Keep walking," Corvin called from the gate, his voice taut. She walked, and the garden woke around her. It happened everywhere she stepped. The yew hedges straightened and flushed dark green. The moss on the fountain softened and spread. Grass pushed up between paving stones, bright and impossibly new. A dead sapling near the far wall shuddered, cracked, and burst into leaves so suddenly that a flock of starlings exploded from the branches of the tree beside it. Saren stopped in the center of the garden and pressed her hands to her mouth. Her eyes burned. She could feel it now, the warmth flowing out of her and into the ground, spreading like roots, reaching for everything broken and pulling it back to life. It felt right in a way that terrified her, like finding a muscle she had never used, but that had always been there. "How?" she whispered. No one answered. When she turned back toward the gate, Corvin was gone. Marin stood alone, her expression thoughtful and deeply worried. "Where did he go?" Saren asked. "To report to the king," Marin said. She crossed to Saren and took her hands, turning them over, examining her palms as if she might find the answer written there. "Have you always been able to do this?" "No," Saren said. Then she hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe. Things always grew better when I was near them. The seeds in the vault, the herbs in the infirmary garden. I just thought I was good at my job." Marin's mouth thinned. "You may be more than good at your job, child." They tested her 3 more times that day. Corvin brought her to the eastern wall, where the foundation stones had split so badly that the masons had declared the damage irreparable. The stone healed when Saren pressed her palms to it. He brought her to the well in the lower courtyard, where the water had turned brackish and sour. It ran clear within minutes of her sitting beside it. Each time, Saren felt the warmth flow out of her. Each time, the sensation was stronger, more certain, more like something unlocking inside her chest. And each time, somewhere in the distance, she felt Theron watching. She never saw him directly, but she could feel his presence, like heat on her skin, and the bond in her chest ached every time it reached for him and found nothing reaching back. Late that afternoon, Corvin summoned her to his office. The room was small and lined with maps of the kingdom, each one marked with pins and notations in a tight, precise hand. "The results are consistent," Corvin said, his voice measured. "Your presence reverses the decay." Siren sat rigidly in the chair across from him. "How is that possible?" "That is what we intend to find out." He paused. "In the meantime, new chambers are being prepared for you. In the royal wing." Siren's heart lurched. The royal wing? "The decay is worst, near the center of the castle, near the throne room, near the king's quarters." He held her gaze. "We need you. Close to the source. Close to the source. Close to Theron. Close to the man whose proximity made the tether between them burn like a brand, and whose absence made it ache like a wound that would not close." "And Lady Vesna," Saren heard herself ask. Something flickered across Corvin's face. "Lady Vesna's chambers are in the royal wing as well." Of course they are, Saren thought, because the universe had a sense of humor and it was exclusively aimed at her. She was escorted to her new rooms that evening. They were larger than anything she had ever occupied, with tall windows overlooking the dying orchards and a fireplace that someone had already lit. Her few belongings had been brought up from the vault. Her worn leather satchel sat on the bed beside a stack of her notebooks and a single pressed flower she kept between the pages of her favorite botanical text. She was arranging her things on the desk when a knock came at the door. It was not Corvin. It was not Marin. Lady Vesna stood in the corridor. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things were beautiful, polished and precise, and designed to make you aware of your own inadequacy. Her dark hair was swept into an arrangement that probably had a name. Saren did not know. Her dress was silk. Her eyes were ice. "You must be the seed keeper," Vesna said. She did not smile. "I am," Saren managed. Vesna's gaze traveled slowly over Siren's face, her worn dress, her dirt-stained fingernails. The assessment was thorough and clearly disappointing. "I want you to understand something," Vesna said, her voice pleasant and smooth and cold as river stone. "Whatever this little talent of yours turns out to be, it changes nothing. The king chose me. That bond is sealed." "I'm not here because I want to be," Saren said, and she was proud of how steady her voice came out. "I'm here because your castle is falling apart." Vesna's smile arrived late and did not reach her eyes. "That shouldn't be complicated for a woman of your station." She turned and walked away, her silk skirts whispering against the stone. Saren closed the door, leaned her back against it, and pressed her hands over her face. 3 months of carefully rebuilding herself. 3 months of teaching herself not to think about the bond, not to reach for it, not to lie awake wondering what was wrong with her, that the king could feel nothing when she felt everything. And now she was living in his wing, sleeping 30 feet from his chambers, with his chosen mate, watching her like a hawk circling a mouse. "This is fine," Saren told herself. "This is completely, absolutely, devastatingly fine." She did not sleep that night. The bond hummed in her chest like a low, persistent note, louder here than it had ever been. She could feel Theron through the wall, not his thoughts, not his feelings, just his presence, the sheer gravitational fact of him somewhere close. Her wolf, dormant and quiet her entire life, had begun pacing beneath her skin with a restlessness that made her want to claw her way out of her own body. At some point past midnight, Saren gave up on sleep and went to the window. The orchards below were silver under the moon, and even from here she could see the blight. Entire rows of trees stood bare and skeletal against the sky. Fruit had rotted on the branch. The ground between the trunks was cracked and dry, as if the earth itself were pulling away from the roots. A movement caught her eye. A figure crossed the orchard path, alone, without guards, without a lantern. Tall and broad-shouldered, his stride long but heavy, like a man carrying something no one else could see. Even at this distance, even in the dark, she knew him. Theron stopped at the edge of the dead trees and stood there with his head bowed, just stood there. His hands hung at his sides, his shoulders curved forward, and even across the distance she could feel the exhaustion rolling off him in waves. He pressed his palm against the trunk of a dead apple tree, held it there, waiting. Nothing happened. He dropped his hand and turned away, and even though she could not see his face, the line of his body spoke of a despair so complete it made her throat tighten. He is watching his kingdom die, Saren realized, and he cannot stop it, and he does not know why. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. The bond ached. In the morning, she left a seedling outside his door. A small thing in a clay pot, an apple sapling she had coaxed to life from one of the vault's oldest seeds. She placed it on the stone floor, with no note, no explanation, and walked away before anyone saw her. She never found out if he kept it. Maren summoned her to the healer's study that afternoon. The room was deep in the oldest part of the castle, its walls lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of texts so old their spines had turned to dust. Maps hung from pegs, and Maren had pinned small markers across them. Red for decay, green for recovery. The pattern was unmistakable. Every green marker clustered around the places Saren had been. "Sit down, child," Maren said. Her voice had a gravity to it that Saren had never heard before. Saren sat. Maren placed a book on the table between them. It was enormous, bound in leather, so old it had gone nearly black, and the pages were thick as cloth. The text was written in the old tongue, dense and angular, with illustrations that glowed faintly in the lamplight. "What is that?" Saren asked. "The Covenant of Valdris," Maren said. She opened the book to a page marked with a strip of faded silk, the founding text of this kingdom, written 900 years ago by the first Alpha King and his mate. Saren stared at the page. The illustration showed two figures standing at the center of a vast landscape, their hands joined, with lines of golden light radiating outward from their clasped hands, and into the earth, the water, the sky. The land around them was green and alive. The land beyond the light's reach was barren and gray. Valdris was not always a kingdom, Maren continued. It was a wasteland. Poisoned soil, dead rivers, cursed ground. The first Alpha King and his fated mate performed a bonding ritual that tied the land to their union. The kingdom lives because the bond lives. The words settled over Saren like a weight. "You're saying the kingdom is alive because of a bond." "I'm saying the kingdom is alive because of the bond between the true mated king and his fated mate," Maren corrected. "Every generation the bond renews. The king finds his mate. The covenant holds. The land thrives." She paused, her gaze fixed on Saren's face. "And when the bond is broken, or denied, or left incomplete, the land dies," Saren whispered. Maren nodded slowly. The silence that followed was so heavy Saren could hear her own heartbeat. "You think I'm his mate," Saren said. The words felt dangerous in her mouth. "You think the king's true mate is me. I don't think it, child. I know it. Your ability to heal the land is proof. Only the fated mate can channel the covenant. It has always been so." Maren leaned forward. "When King Theron chose Lady Vesna at the choosing, he chose a political alliance over the bond. He may not have felt it clearly. Some alphas don't, not immediately. But the covenant does not care about politics. It does not care about alliances or bloodlines or strategic advantage. The land needs its conduit, and the conduit is you." Saren's chest constricted. "Does he know? Corvin has briefed him on our findings," Maren said carefully. "Whether the king accepts the full implications is another matter. And if he doesn't?" Saren asked, her voice barely audible. Maren closed the book. "If the bond remains incomplete, the covenant will continue to fail. The decay will accelerate. The rivers will dry. The soil will turn to ash." She met Saren's eyes. "I give it 4 months. After that, Valdris will be beyond saving." 4 months. Saren pressed her hands flat against the table and tried to breathe around the enormity of it. She was not just useful. She was not just a curiosity. She was the only thing standing between an entire kingdom and extinction. And the one person who could complete the bond was a man who had already chosen someone else. "What do I do?" she asked. "For now you stay close. You walk the grounds, you let the land feel your presence, and you let me research whether there is a way to channel the covenant without requiring the full bond." "Is there?" Marin hesitated 1 second too long. "I will look into it." Saren walked back to her chambers in a daze. The corridors seemed different now that she knew what ran beneath them. Not just stone and mortar, but something alive, something ancient, something connected to her in a way she had never asked for and did not know how to refuse. She sat on her bed and pressed her hands together so tightly her knuckles ached. All her life, she had been nobody, a foundling with no family, no bloodline, no claim to anything. She had made peace with that, had built a quiet life in the vault, a small life, but one that was hers. And now, the kingdom itself was telling her she was essential, that she mattered in a way so enormous, it made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. And the cruel, impossible twist was that the man at the center of it all had looked at her and felt nothing, or so she believed. That evening, Saren walked the castle corridors before bed. Her chambers felt too large, too empty, too aware of the man on the other side of the wall. She needed to move, needed to think, needed to feel something other than the constant pull in her chest. She turned a corner and nearly walked straight into Theron. He caught her by the arm before she stumbled, his hand closed around her elbow, and the contact sent a shock through her body so violent her vision went white at the edges. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the castle's response. The moment his skin touched hers, a sound rolled through the walls, deep and resonant, like a bell struck underground. The stone beneath their feet flushed warm. And along the corridor, carved into the ancient walls in patterns so faded they had been invisible for centuries, runes began to glow. Golden light traced the carvings, racing along the corridor in both directions, illuminating symbols and patterns that no one alive had ever seen lit. The light was warm and alive and impossibly beautiful, and it pulsed in rhythm with Saren's heartbeat. Theron stared at the walls. Then he looked down at his hand on her arm. His pupils were blown wide, his chest rising and falling too quickly. He released her like she had burned him. The runes faded, the warmth retreated, the corridor went dark. They stood 3 feet apart in the sudden dimness, both breathing hard, and the silence between them was so charged it felt combustible. "Forgive me," Theron said, his voice rough. "That wasn't," Saren started. "I didn't." But he was already walking away, his stride long and rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She watched him disappear around the corner and pressed her own trembling hand to the spot on her arm where his fingers had been. The skin was still warm. Her heart was racing so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She looked at the wall beside her. The runes had gone dark, but when she reached out and traced one with her fingertip, she felt a faint vibration beneath the stone, like something sleeping, like something waiting, like a heart that had not yet decided whether to start beating again. A routine formed over the following days, fragile and careful, and heavy with all the things neither of them said. Every morning, Seren walked the grounds. She followed a path that Corvin had mapped based on the worst decay, starting in the orchards and winding through the lower gardens, past the failing wells, along the crumbling eastern wall. The land healed as she walked. The color returned to the soil, the water cleared, trees straightened and leaves unfurled in her wake like small green flags of surrender. But the healing did not hold. By the next morning, the decay had crept back. Not as far, not as deep, but persistent. The land healed beneath her feet and sickened again behind her back, like a patient whose fever broke each morning only to return by nightfall. "The proximity helps," Marin told her. "But proximity alone is not enough. The covenant requires the complete bond to sustain itself. What you are doing is tending a wound without closing it, and so Corvin made the adjustment that Saren had been dreading. If proximity to Saren helped, and proximity to the king amplified the effect, then they would walk together. Absolutely not, was Theron's response, delivered in a tone that could have frozen a lake solid. Your Majesty, Corvin said, with the particular patience of a man who had been managing his king's stubbornness for years. The eastern wall is failing. The masons cannot keep pace with the damage. If walking with Miss Saren for 1 hour each morning stabilizes the foundations, then find another way to stabilize them. There is no other way. We have tried. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Saren, who was standing in the corridor outside the study, pretending she could not hear every word, to consider climbing out a window. 1 hour, Theron said finally. No more. Their first walk together was agonizing. Saren kept her eyes on the path, her hands clasped behind her back, her mouth shut. Theron walked beside her, like a man being marched to his own sentencing, his jaw set, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed, somewhere in the middle distance. 4 guards followed at a discreet distance. The silence between them could have crushed stone, but the land responded, not like it did when Saren walked alone, gradual and gentle. When Theron was beside her, the healing was immediate. The orchard trees flushed green, so fast the branches creaked. The cracked soil sealed itself with a sound like deep breathing. A well, they passed, filled so rapidly the water crested the rim and spilled across the flagstones. Saren glanced at Theron and found him staring at a row of apple trees that had been dead stumps 10 minutes ago and were now heavy with white blossoms. Something crossed his face that she could not read. Pain? Maybe. Or the particular kind of grief that came from realizing how much you had lost only when you began to get it back. He said nothing. They walked in silence. At the end of the hour, he turned on his heel and left, without a word. But the next morning, he was waiting at the orchard gate. Days passed. The walks continued. Saren tried to be invisible, which was difficult when you were the reason the landscape was spontaneously flowering. She kept her distance, kept her silence, kept every feeling locked behind the walls. She had spent 3 months building. It was Theron who broke first. On the 4th morning, as they passed a row of rose bushes that erupted into crimson bloom the moment they walked by, he said, "Do you always talk to them?" Saren startled. She had been murmuring to the roses without realizing it, the way she always did when she worked, encouraging them, coaxing them, old habit. "They respond better when you're kind to them," she said, embarrassment heating her cheeks. "Plants, listen. Plants, listen," he repeated. "They do. There are studies. Well, old texts in the vault." She was babbling. She heard herself babbling and could not stop. The vibration of the voice affects growth patterns. "It is documented, you are telling me," Theron said slowly, "that you talk to flowers because of documented scientific evidence." "Yes," Saren said firmly. He looked at her. Really looked at her, for the first time since the choosing, and the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing she had seen on his face since she had arrived in the royal wing, and it made her heart do something painful and wonderful and terrifying all at once. "Carry on then," he said, and turned back to the path. That evening she found a book on her desk, an old botanical text from the castle library, so rare she had only ever read about its existence. Inside the cover, in a hand she did not recognize, someone had written, "For the woman who talks to flowers." There was no signature, but there did not need to be. The small moments accumulated after that, not quickly, not dramatically. Like rain filling a basin, one drop at a time, so gradually you did not notice until the water reached your fingers. He asked about the seed vault. She told him about the thousands of specimens stored beneath the castle, the centuries of botanical knowledge preserved in tiny envelopes and glass jars. He listened with an attention that startled her, asking questions that revealed a mind far more curious than his cold exterior suggested. She learned things about him in return. Not because he volunteered them, but because she watched, and she was very good at watching. She noticed that he rubbed the scar on his left wrist when he was thinking, that he checked the orchards from his study window every morning before their walk, tracking the decay's progress, that he carried the weight of the kingdom's suffering in the rigid set of his shoulders and the shadows beneath his eyes that grew deeper every day. She caught him watching her once from a second-floor window as she knelt in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, coaxing a dead herb bed back to life. She looked up, and their eyes met. He held her gaze for 3 full heartbeats before looking away. And even across the distance, she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. He was fighting something. She could feel it through the bond, a constant, grinding tension, like 2 forces pulling him in opposite directions, the duty he had chosen and the bond he had denied. The woman he had committed to and the woman the land itself was screaming for him to claim. And Siren, who had built her entire life around not wanting things she could not have, was finding it harder every day not to want him. She never spoke of it. She never reached for him. She kept her distance during their walks, kept her voice measured, kept her hands to herself. She was a seed keeper doing a job, nothing more. But at night, alone in her chambers with the wall between them, she pressed her palm flat against the cold stone and felt the faintest vibration in answer. It was late on the 9th night when Siren heard it, a sound through the wall. Not conversation, not movement, something deeper, rougher, more animal. A growl that was not a growl, but a groan, low and sustained. The sound of a man wrestling something inside himself that refused to surrender. Siren sat up in bed, her heart hammering. She pressed her ear to the wall. Theron's wolf was fighting him. She could feel it through the bond, now that she was listening for it. The alpha's wolf, the primal half of him that operated on instinct rather than strategy, was clawing toward the surface. She could feel its fury, its anguish, its single-minded, howling insistence that its mate was right there, right on the other side of the wall, and he was doing nothing about it, and Theron was holding it back, forcing it down, locking it away with an iron will that must have been costing him everything. Siren sat in the dark, with her hand against the wall, and felt tears burn her eyes. He was not cold. He had never been cold. He was at war with himself. He had felt the bond at the choosing and had chosen duty over instinct, kingdom over desire, alliance over fate, and, every day since, his wolf had been tearing him apart from the inside. She pulled her hand from the wall and pressed it over her mouth. She could not fix this. She could not be what the covenant needed without his consent, and she could not ask for what the bond demanded without destroying everything he had built with Vesna. She was trapped. He was trapped. And the kingdom was dying between them. The sounds faded some time before dawn. Siren lay awake in the silence and stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about the way his mouth had almost smiled when she told him she talked to flowers. In the morning, the world was worse. A rider arrived at the castle before sunrise, his horse lathered, his face gray with shock. An entire village to the north, Thornbury, had lost its harvest overnight. Not gradually. Not through the slow creep of decay that had been spreading across the kingdom for months. The crops had simply died. Every stalk, every root, every green thing in the surrounding fields, gone black and brittle between sunset and sunrise, as if a hand had reached down and wrung the life from the soil in a single savage twist. The news hit the castle like a physical blow. Siren stood in the corridor outside the council chamber and listened to the shouting inside. Theron's voice, low and furious. Corvin's, measured and urgent. Other voices she did not recognize, frightened and overlapping. Marin found her there and pulled her into an alcove. "This is not natural decay," the old healer said, her voice pitched low enough that no one passing could hear. "The pattern is wrong. Decay spreads outward from the center, following the Covenant's failure. This was targeted. Specific. An entire village stripped of life in a single night. Saren's blood went cold. You're saying something did this on purpose? Marin's expression was grim. I'm saying the Covenant is not just failing. Saren, something is feeding on its failure. Something is pulling the life from this land. Faster than you can put it back. She gripped Saren's arm. And whatever it is getting stronger. Through the council chamber doors, Saren heard Theron's voice rise above the others, tight with barely controlled fury, and beneath the fear, beneath the dread, she felt the bond in her chest pulse once, hard, like a second heartbeat, like a warning. Corvin arranged the expedition to Thornbury 2 days later. Saren rode in the back of the supply wagon, wedged between sacks of grain and a crate of clean water. The guards who accompanied them kept their distance, clearly unsure what to make of her. The seed keeper who made floors glow and dead gardens bloom. The woman whose name the king's beta spoke with a deference usually reserved for people of rank. Theron did not come with them. She told herself that was fine. The road north wound through countryside that should have been green with late summer growth. Instead, the fields were brown and brittle, the hedgerows stripped bare, the rivers running shallow and clouded. Saren pressed her hand against the side of the wagon and felt the land's exhaustion pulsing through the wood and metal, a slow, deep throb of something being drained. Thornbury was worse than she had imagined. The village itself was intact. The houses stood, the fences held, the roads were clear, but everything that had been alive was gone. The kitchen gardens behind every cottage were fields of ash-gray stalks. The orchards were skeletal. The communal grain stores, which should have been full for the coming winter, held nothing but dust. Even the grass between the paving stones had turned to powder. The villagers watched her arrive with hollow eyes and the careful blankness of people who had stopped hoping. "Start here," Corvin said, gesturing to the nearest field. "Do what you can." Saren knelt at the edge of the dead farmland and pressed her palms into the soil. The warmth came immediately rushing down her arms and into the earth. She felt the familiar pulse of the Covenant responding to her touch, felt the golden energy spread outward through the root systems and the aquifers and the deep structures of the land. And then something grabbed back. It happened so fast, she had no time to pull away. One moment she was channeling warmth into the soil, the next she was somewhere else entirely, not physically. Her body was still kneeling in the field, her hands still pressed to the dirt. But her mind had been yanked downward, through layers of earth and stone and root, into a darkness so complete it had weight. She could not see, she could not hear, but she could feel. Something vast moved beneath her. Beneath the soil, beneath the bedrock, beneath the foundations of the kingdom itself. Something old and patient and desperately, ravenously hungry. It pressed against the underside of the world, like a beast testing the bars of its cage, and everywhere it pressed, the land above it died, the wasting. The word arrived in her mind without being spoken, as if the thing itself had placed it there. Saren tried to pull away, tried to surface, but the darkness held her, and then it spoke, not in words, in feeling. A wave of cold understanding that washed through her mind and left her gasping. It showed her what it was. A void that had existed before the kingdom, before the Covenant, before the first Alpha King and his mate had poured their joined power into the land and forced life from poisoned ground. The wasting was what the land had been before. Death and emptiness and the patient certainty that all living things eventually return to nothing. The Covenant had sealed it, pushed it down, held it beneath the surface with the sheer force of the bond between king and mate, generation after generation. And now, the seal was cracking. Saren felt it reaching for her, tasting the golden energy she carried, drinking it. Every drop of life she poured into the soil was flowing straight through and feeding the thing below. She was not healing the land, she was feeding its destroyer. A scream tore from her throat. Hands grabbed her shoulders and wrenched her backward. She came up gasping, her vision swimming, her fingers clawed and trembling. Corvin was kneeling beside her, his face tight with alarm. "What happened?" he demanded. Siren could not speak. She was shaking so badly, her teeth chattered, and the cold from the vision had settled into her bones like frost. She looked down at her hands. The skin of her palms was gray. The color leached from them as if something had sucked the warmth right through her flesh. "There's something down there," she managed, her voice barely a rasp. "Beneath the land. It's alive, and it's eating everything I give." The ride back to the castle was silent. Siren huddled in the wagon and pressed her gray palms together and tried to stop the shaking. It did not stop. She told Marin everything. The old healer listened without interrupting, her face growing graver with every sentence. When Siren finished, Marin sat back and closed her eyes. "The wasting," Marin murmured. "I had suspected. The old texts reference it, but I hoped it was allegory." "It is not allegory," Siren said. "It is real, and it is hungry, and every time I heal the surface, I am feeding it." "Then we stop the surface healing until we understand more," Marin said firmly. "And we tell the king?" They told the king. They told him in the private study. Just the four of them. Siren, Marin, Corvin, and Theron. The fire in the grate cast shifting shadows across Theron's face as he listened. And Siren watched the last traces of hope drain from his expression, like water from a cracked vessel. When Marin finished explaining, the silence was crushing. "You're telling me," Theron said slowly, "that she has been pouring her own life force into the land, and that something beneath us has been consuming it." "Yes," Marin confirmed. "And that her hands turned gray." "The color has returned," Siren said quickly, holding up her palms. They were still slightly ashen at the centers, but she tucked them into her lap before anyone could look too closely. Theron's gaze lingered on her hands, and something in his jaw tightened so hard she could see the muscle jump. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "The walks stop," he said. "Your Majesty," Marin began. "The walks stop, the healing stops. I will not have her drained by that thing." His voice was low and controlled, but the edges were ragged. "Find another way." "There may not be another way without the complete bond," Marin pressed. The word bond landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Theron went rigid. "There will be another way," he said, and the finality in his voice sealed the conversation shut. But it did not end there. Vesna had been watching. Siren did not know how much the lady had heard or guessed, but by the following afternoon, the court was buzzing. Whispers about the foundling seed-keeper who slept in the royal wing. Whispers about the king who walked with her every morning, while his chosen mate took breakfast alone. Whispers about a bond that should not exist between a man who had already declared his union. Siren heard the whispers in the corridors, in the servants' hall, in the careful silences that fell whenever she entered a room. She had spent her whole life being invisible. Now she was visible in the worst possible way, not as a person, but as a scandal. Vesna did not whisper. She spoke clearly, at dinner, in front of the entire court. "Perhaps," she said, her voice carrying with surgical precision across the candlelit hall, "if the seed-keeper's talents are no longer needed, she might be more comfortable returning to her vault. I imagine she misses her flowers." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the court. The sound was thin and cruel, and made Siren feel like the floor had dropped out from beneath her chair. The hall went quiet. Every gaze shifted to Theron. Siren sat at the far end of the table, her food untouched, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles ached. She did not look up. She did not need to. She could feel his eyes on her, could feel the bond straining between them, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. She waited for him to defend her, to say something, anything. "Miss Siren's quarters will be reassigned," Theron said. His voice was steady, his face was stone. "Corvin, see to it." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. The room swam. She heard murmurs of approval from the courtiers nearest Vesna, heard the quiet, satisfied sound of a court that had decided the natural order had been restored. She left the hall before anyone could see her face. She made it to the corridor, then the stairwell, then the dark passage that led down to the vault. Her vault, the small underground room where she had spent her entire life being invisible and safe and alone. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and slid to the floor. The stone was cold against her spine. She pulled her knees to her chest and pressed her forehead against them and breathed. He had chosen Vesna, again Selish. He had looked at Saren across a crowded hall and chosen duty, chosen politics, chosen the woman who wore silk while Saren wore soil, had let the court laugh at her and said nothing. And the worst part, the part that made her chest feel like it was caving in, was that she could feel through the bond that it was destroying him, too. She could feel his anguish bleeding through the tether between them, raw and ragged and desperate. He had not wanted to say those words. Every syllable had cost him something, but he had said them anyway. The days after her removal from the royal wing were the worst of Saren's life. She moved back into the vault, her small cot, her familiar shelves, her jars and seeds and pressed flowers, everything exactly as she had left it. But the space that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a tomb. The bond was relentless. She had read about incomplete bonds in the old texts, the way they punished separation, the way the body rebelled against the distance. She had thought she understood. She had been wrong. The headaches started on the second day, dull at first, then sharpening into something that drove behind her eyes like iron nails. She could not tolerate light. The seed vault's dim lanterns, which she had worked under happily for years, now sent lancing pain through her skull. She drew the curtains and worked in near darkness, her hands trembling as she labeled specimens she could barely see. The nausea came on the third day. She stopped eating because nothing would stay down. Marin brought her broths and tonics and sat with her in the dark vault with an expression that hovered between professional concern and barely concealed fury. "This is madness," Marin said on the fourth morning, watching Saren retch into a basin. "Your body is shutting down." "I'm fine," Saren gasped, wiping her mouth with a shaking hand. "You are very clearly not fine. You have lost weight you did not have to lose. Your hands are still gray at the centers. And your wolf," Saren flinched. Her wolf, the part of her that had slept so deeply for so many years she had almost forgotten it existed, was howling. Not outwardly, inwardly. A constant, keening cry that vibrated through her bones and made every cell in her body ache with longing for something it could not reach. "My wolf is adjusting," Saren lied. Marin gave her a look that could have curdled milk. The kingdom was adjusting too. Badly. Without Saren's daily walks, the decay accelerated with terrifying speed. The orchards she had healed went black within 3 days. The wells turned brackish. The eastern wall, which her touch had sealed, cracked open wider than before, and this time a section of the rampart collapsed, injuring 2 guards. Reports arrived daily, each one worse than the last. 3 more villages lost their harvests overnight. A river to the west reversed its course for 6 hours and then stopped flowing entirely. Livestock sickened. Children developed fevers that no healer could break. And beneath it all, Saren could feel the wasting growing stronger. Even from the vault, even through layers of stone and earth, she could sense it pressing upward, testing, pushing, feeding on the kingdom's pain. Some nights, she lay on her cot and felt it pulsing beneath the floor, like a second heartbeat, slow and patient and deeply, horribly satisfied. She caught glimpses of Theron through the vault's narrow ground-level windows. His tall frame crossing the courtyard, his stride heavier than before. Once she saw him stop and lean against a wall, pressing his hand to his chest as though something inside it was trying to tear free. He stayed like that for nearly a minute before straightening and walking on. She watched him another time, standing at the edge of the dead orchards in the rain. He did not move for so long that the water pooled in the creases of his coat and ran from his sleeves. A guard approached him and said something. Theron did not respond. The guard retreated. On the third evening, Marin came to the vault with a fresh tonic and a piece of information she delivered like a knife. "Corvin tells me the king has not eaten in 2 days," she said, setting the cup down with a sharp clink. "His wolf is destabilizing. The guards heard him shifting involuntarily last night. Partial shifts, just the hands, just the jaw, the kind that happen when the animal half is overpowering the human half." Siren's chest contracted so violently, she had to grip the edge of her work table. "Is he in danger?" "He is the danger," Marin said quietly. "An alpha in bond rejection is a volatile thing. His control is fracturing. And when an alpha of his power loses control, people die." The words sat between them, heavy and terrible. He was suffering. She could feel it through the bond, a constant undercurrent of pain and exhaustion, and the slow, grinding anguish of a man who understood he was the architect of his own ruin, but could not stop building. But she had not known it was this bad. She had not known his body was turning against him, the same way hers was turning against her. They were mirrors of each other's destruction, separated by stone walls and pride, and a choice that was killing them both. On the 5th day, Siren collapsed in the vault. She was reaching for a jar on the upper shelf when her vision went white and her leg simply stopped working. She hit the stone floor hard, and the jar shattered beside her, scattering dried foxglove across the tiles. Marin found her there 20 minutes later, curled on her side among the broken glass, too weak to stand. "That is enough," Marin said, her voice shaking with a fury that Siren had never heard from her before. The old healer gathered Siren into her arms with surprising strength and carried her to the infirmary cot like she weighed nothing at all. And Siren realized with a distant and terrible clarity that she probably did weigh almost nothing by now. Marin sat beside her for a long time without speaking. She held Siren's hand and rubbed warmth back into the gray fingers, and when she finally spoke, her voice was rough. "You stubborn child," Marin said. "You, impossible, selfless, infuriating. You knew this was getting worse, and you said nothing." "I didn't want to worry you," Siren murmured. "You collapsed on a stone floor, surrounded by broken glass." "I am well past worried." Marin squeezed her hand hard enough to hurt. "You are the closest thing I have to a daughter. Do you understand that? When they left you on those steps, wrapped in nothing but wool and moonlight, I picked you up, and I chose you. And I will not watch you disappear into the ground for a man who is too proud to see what he is losing." Siren's eyes burned. She turned her face away so Marin would not see the tears, but the old healer had spent 20 years reading her face and was not fooled. When Siren could focus again, Marin was sitting beside her with the Covenant text open in her lap and an expression that meant the conversation ahead would not be gentle. "I should have told you this sooner," Marin said. "I was hoping the king would come to his senses before it became necessary." "Told me what?" Siren whispered. Marin turned the book so Siren could see the page. The illustration showed a single figure, a woman, standing at the center of the same landscape from the earlier image. But in this version, the woman was translucent. Light poured from her body into the land, and where the light left her, her form grew thinner, more ghostly, more absent. "The covenant does not simply wait for the bond to complete," Marin said, her voice low and careful. "When it identifies the conduit, it begins drawing on her. Slowly at first, then faster. If the bond is completed, the king shares the burden. The draw stabilizes. The conduit is sustained by the bond itself." "And if the bond is not completed?" Siren asked, though she already felt the answer in her bones. "The covenant will continue to draw from you regardless. It does not care whether the bond is sealed. It only knows that you are the channel, and the land needs life." Marin paused. "Without the bond to sustain you, the draw will eventually take everything you have." Siren stared at her. "You're saying the covenant will kill me?" Marin closed the book. Her eyes were bright with tears. She was clearly fighting not to shed. I am saying that if this continues, you will pour yourself into the land until there is nothing left. And the cruelest part, her voice cracked slightly, is that it still will not be enough. Without the complete bond, the wasting will consume whatever you give. Your sacrifice would save nothing. The word settled into Siren's chest and lay there like stones. She thought about the vault, her cot, her seeds, her quiet life. She thought about the day she had been left on the castle steps, nameless and unwanted, and how she had spent every year since trying to earn her place by being useful, by being small, by never asking for anything that was not freely offered. And now, the land itself was taking from her, whether she offered or not. How long? Siren asked. Weeks, Marin said. Perhaps a month, perhaps less. Does the king know? Marin's jaw tightened. He does not know about this. She gestured at Siren, at her thinning frame, her ashen palms, the shadows that had carved themselves beneath her eyes. Healer and patient confidentiality. Siren almost laughed. Almost. So I'm dying, and the man who could save me doesn't know, and the kingdom is dying, and the thing that could save it is the same thing. He keeps refusing. That is an accurate summary, yes, Marin said flatly. Siren lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the book Theron had left on her desk, For the Woman Who Talks to Flowers. She thought about the way his mouth had almost smiled in the orchard. She thought about his hand on the dead apple tree in the moonlight, pressing, hoping, finding nothing. She thought about Marin's words, "You are the closest thing I have to a daughter." All her life, Siren had believed she was not worth fighting for, that the parents who had left her on the castle steps had seen something lacking in her, something unworthy, and that their judgment was correct. She had built her life around smallness, around usefulness, around never asking for more than she was given, and it had nearly killed her. But somewhere between the glowing floor and the dead orchards, and the runes that pulsed with her heartbeat, something had shifted. She was not small. She was not invisible. She was the heart of a kingdom, and the man who could not see that was the one who needed saving. Not from a curse or a monster, but from his own refusal to accept what was standing right in front of him. "I need to see Corvin," she said. She found Corvin in his study, poring over supply reports, with the grim efficiency of a man trying to hold a crumbling world together with paperwork. "I need your help," Siren said from the doorway. The beta looked up. His gaze swept over her, cataloging the weight she had lost, the gray in her skin, the way she braced herself against the doorframe, like standing required conscious effort. "Sit down before you fall down," he said. Siren sat. "I need to see the king. He has given orders that you are not to be brought to him. I know what he ordered. I also know that his kingdom is dying. I am dying, and he is the only person who can stop both." Corvin set down his pen. "You're dying? The covenant is draining me. Without the completed bond, it will take everything I have." She held his gaze. "Marin gives me weeks." Something shifted in Corvin's expression. Not surprise. More like the final piece of a pattern clicking into place. "I suspected as much," he said quietly. "You've looked worse every day." "Charming," Siren muttered. The corner of his mouth twitched. "You want me to arrange access to his chambers, please?" Corvin leaned back in his chair and studied her. "The king is stubborn. He has convinced himself that keeping you away protects you. That honoring his commitment to Lady Vesna is the right thing to do. That there is a solution that does not require him to break the promise he made at the choosing." "There isn't," Siren said. "No," Corvin agreed. "There isn't. But he is the king, and kings do not easily admit they were wrong." He paused, especially when being wrong means they have been slowly killing the woman they are bonded to. The words landed heavily. Siren swallowed. "I'll get you in tonight," Corvin said, "but convincing him is your task. And you should know," he added as she rose to leave. "Lady Vesna requested a meeting with me this morning." Siren paused. "About what?" The word hung in the air between them. "Leaving?" Saren repeated. She is not blind, Corvin said. She sees what is happening to the kingdom. She sees what is happening to him. Whatever else Lady Vesna may be, she is not a fool. Siren left Corvin's study and made it halfway down the corridor before she changed direction. Her feet carried her to the east wing, to the door she had never knocked on before, to the chambers of the woman who had told her to fix the castle and leave. Vesna opened the door herself. She looked at Saren for a long moment, taking in the ashen skin, the thinning frame, the hollowed eyes. You look terrible, Vesna said. I know, Saren replied. May I come in? Vesna stepped aside. Her chambers were beautiful, immaculate, and oddly empty. Several trunks stood near the wardrobe, half-packed. You're leaving, Saren said softly. Vesna moved to the window and stood with her back to the room. For the first time the polished exterior showed cracks. I never felt it, Vesna said quietly. The bond, when he placed his hand on my shoulder at the choosing, I waited for the pull, the recognition, the certainty. Everyone talks about it like lightning, like being struck. She paused. I felt nothing. I thought it would come with time. It didn't, Saren said. It was not a question. No. Vesna turned to face her. Her eyes were dry, but her voice held a rawness that surprised Saren. He tried. I'll give him that. He was dutiful, attentive, committed to making it work. But I could feel him pulling away, not toward someone else. Not then, just away. Like part of him was somewhere I could not reach. Saren's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be honest with me. Vesna's chin lifted. Is it real? The bond between you and him? Is it the true bond? Yes, Saren said. There was no point in pretending otherwise. Vesna nodded once. The movement was precise, final, like a door closing. Then do what I cannot, she said. Save him. Save the kingdom. And do not waste time feeling guilty about me. I am a political creature. I will land on my feet. Her mouth curved into something that was almost, not quite, a smile. I always do. Saren reached out and touched Vesna's hand. The lady stiffened, then allowed it. Thank you, Saren whispered. Go, Vesna said, before I change my mind about being gracious. That night, a guard escorted Saren through corridors she had walked before in the opposite direction. Up from the vault, through the great hall, past the dying banners and into the royal wing. Every step brought her closer to the pull in her chest. Every step made the bond burn brighter. The guard opened the door to the king's chambers without a word and left. Saren stepped inside. The room was dark except for the fire in the grate, and the shadows it threw were long and restless. His scent surrounded her immediately, warm and deep and achingly familiar, despite the fact that she had never been allowed to know it well enough for it to feel familiar. He was standing by the window with his back to the door, and the line of his shoulders told her everything. He knew she was there. He had felt her coming. Corvin let you in, Theron said without turning. It was not a question. Yes. I ordered him not to. He disobeyed. You should promote him. A sound escaped Theron, something between a laugh and a groan. He turned, and she saw his face in the firelight, and her heart cracked. He looked destroyed. The shadows beneath his eyes were deep enough to hold secrets. His cheekbones stood out sharply, the flesh beneath them hollowed. He had lost weight, not as much as she had, but enough that the man standing before her was a diminished version of the king she had first seen at the choosing. You need to leave, he said, but there was no force behind it. The words sounded rehearsed, exhausted, emptied of conviction. No, Saren said. Saren, I am dying. She said it plainly, without drama, without self-pity, just fact. The covenant is draining me. Without the bond, it will take everything I have within weeks. Marin confirmed it. His face went white. What? You heard me. He moved toward her, then stopped himself, his hands clenching at his sides. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because you ordered everyone away. Because you convinced yourself that distance was protection. Because you are so determined to do the right thing that you cannot see you are killing both of us." He flinched like she had struck him. "I was trying to protect you from the wasting, and instead you handed me to the Covenant, which is doing the same thing, only slower." She stepped closer. He did not step back. "You felt the bond at the choosing, didn't you?" The question hung between them. She watched his throat work, watched the war play out across his features, watched the moment he stopped fighting. "Yes," he said, and the word came out broken. "I felt it. I felt everything. You were standing in the back of the hall in a dress that had been mended twice at the hem, and your hands had dirt on them, and you were the most terrifying thing I had ever seen." Siren's eyes filled with tears. "Terrifying?" "Because I knew," he said, his voice rough and raw and shaking. "I knew you were mine. I knew it the way I know my own name. And I chose Vesna anyway because the southern border was bleeding and my people were dying, and I thought duty was more important than what I wanted. And now?" He looked at her. Not the guarded glance he had been rationing himself for months, but a full, undefended look, the way he had not allowed himself to see her since the night of the choosing. His eyes moved over her face, her thinning frame, her ashen palms, and she watched something in him shatter. "Now I am watching you die because of a choice I made, and it is the worst thing I have ever done." His voice broke on the last word. Siren crossed the remaining distance between them and placed her hand on his chest. His heartbeat slammed against her palm, wild and desperate. His hand came up and covered hers, pressing it harder against him, and the contact sent a surge of warmth through her body, so intense, her knees nearly buckled. Then, "Stop choosing duty," she whispered. "Choose me." It was not gentle. It was 3 months of denied bond and dying kingdom, and bone-deep grief pouring through the place where their mouths met. His hands cradled her face, his thumbs wiping the tears from her cheeks, and Siren kissed him back with everything she had left. "If I do this," he said against her lips, "there is no going back. I know. The court will not accept it easily. I know. And the wasting is still beneath us. The bond may not be enough to seal it. Then we fight it together," she said. "But we fight it, bonded. We fight it whole." He lifted her, his arms wrapping around her, with a desperate tenderness that made her gasp. She buried her face in his neck, breathing him in, feeling the bond ignite between them like a match struck in a dark room. What followed was overwhelming and tender and fierce, all at once. The bond between them deepened with every whispered word, every moment of closeness, every breath shared in the firelight. It felt like reclaiming something that had been denied too long, and the bond blazed brighter with each passing moment until it filled the room with warmth. When the mating bite came, Siren felt the bond seal itself like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. She marked him in return, claiming him as hers, and the bond roared to life between them, golden and vast and blazing. The castle responded. The runes in the walls flared to life. All of them, every corridor, every chamber, every ancient carving that had been dark for generations. Golden light poured through the stone, like sunrise through stained glass. The ground trembled, the air hummed. Somewhere deep in the castle, a bell that had not rung in 900 years tolled once, clear and resonant, and fell silent. They held each other in the golden aftermath, breathing hard, hearts pounding in unison. Siren pressed her forehead to his chest and felt the bond settle into her bones, warm and right and whole. "Your palms," Theron murmured, lifting her hands and turning them over. The gray was gone. Her skin was warm, flushed, alive. Siren laughed, a wet, shaky sound of pure relief. They lay together in the firelight, his arms wrapped around her, her head resting on his chest. She felt him surrender to something he had been fighting for 3 months, felt the tension leave his body, inch by inch, as the bond held them both. Sleep came for him first. Deep and instant and total, the sleep of a man whose wolf had finally stopped howling. Siren watched his face in the firelight, traced the line of his jaw with her fingertip, and felt joy so sharp it hurt. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her too. She woke in darkness. Not the warm darkness of his chambers, not the amber glow of dying firelight, a cold, absolute darkness that pressed against her skin like hands made of ice. The air smelled of ash and something older than ash, something that had never been alive. The wasting had found them. The darkness was not empty, it breathed. It pressed against Saren's skin, like cold water, invasive and deliberate, filling her lungs with the taste of ash and absence. She could not see, could not hear, could not feel the edges of her own body. There was only the dark, vast, and patient and aware. "Theron," she called. Her voice did not echo. It was absorbed immediately, swallowed whole, as if sound itself could not survive here, but the bond could. She felt him through it, a blazing point of warmth somewhere in the black, and she followed the pull until her outstretched hand found his. His fingers closed around hers, tight and desperate, and the contact sent golden light blooming between their joined palms. The light pushed the darkness back, just enough for her to see. They were standing on stone. Not the stone of the castle, not flagstone or tile, but raw, ancient bedrock, the bones of the kingdom itself. The wasting surrounded them on every side, a living absence that moved and shifted and watched. It was enormous. There were no edges to it, no shape, no form. It was simply everywhere that the light was not pressing against the fragile golden barrier their joined hands created, testing it the way a predator tested the walls of a cage. "This is where it lives," Theron said, his voice tight. "Beneath everything. Beneath the castle. Beneath the fields. Beneath the rivers. This is what the Covenant holds down." "Not anymore," Saren whispered. She could feel it. The ancient barrier that had separated the wasting from the surface world for 900 years had crumbled entirely, eroded by 3 months of a denied bond. The only thing standing between this void and the kingdom above was the two of them and the fragile new bond blazing between their clasped hands. The wasting moved closer. And then it spoke, not in words but in feeling, the same way it had spoken to Saren in the fields of Thornbury, a wave of cold certainty that washed through her mind and settled in the deepest, most vulnerable places. It showed her the castle steps, a winter night, a baby wrapped in wool, placed on cold stone, and the sound of footsteps walking away. "You were left," the wasting said without speaking, "unwanted, unnamed. You are nothing. You have always been nothing, and the moment he sees what you truly are, he will leave you too." The images twisted. She saw herself through the wasting's lens, small and plain and perpetually dirty, standing in the back of a glittering hall in a mended dress, invisible, insignificant. A foundling playing at belonging in a world that had never been meant for her. Saren's grip on Theron's hand faltered. The golden light flickered. "Saren," Theron said sharply. "It's showing me things," she managed, her voice shaking. "It's showing me what I believe about myself." The wasting turned on Theron next. She felt it through the bond, felt the wave of cold strike him. It showed him the choosing. The moment his eyes had found Saren in the crowd, and the bond had ignited in his chest, and he had walked past her. The deliberate, cowardly, calculated cruelty of choosing politics over the woman his soul had recognized. "You knew," the wasting whispered to him. "You knew she was yours, and you chose strategy over truth. Every king before you was brave enough to accept the bond. You were not. You are the weakest alpha to ever hold the throne." Theron's hand tightened around hers, but she could feel him wavering, feel the shame flooding through the bond, thick and suffocating. The wasting was right. He had known, he had chosen wrong, and his kingdom had nearly died for it. The golden light dimmed, the darkness pressed closer, and Saren understood. The wasting did not feed on the failed covenant. It fed on what had caused the covenant to fail. Denial, rejection, the refusal to accept what was true. Every lie they told themselves about their own worth, every belief that they did not deserve what the bond offered, every act of hiding and diminishing and turning away from love, it fed the void. The wasting was not an enemy. It was an absence, the absence of acceptance, the absence of truth, and it could only exist in the spaces where they refused to see themselves clearly. Seren turned to Theron. She could barely see him in the dying light, but she could feel him, feel every tremor of his shame and grief, and the terrible crushing weight of a mistake he did not know how to undo. "It's lying," she said. "It's not," he said. "I did know, I did choose wrong." "Yes, you did." She did not soften it. The truth mattered here more than comfort. "And I spent my whole life believing I wasn't worth choosing. I built an entire life around being small enough to never be rejected again. Because if I never asked for anything, no one could refuse me." She stepped closer. The light between their hands steadied. "But I am not nothing. I was never nothing. The parents who left me made a choice, and that choice was about them, not about me." The words burned coming out, raw and real and harder to say than anything she had ever spoken. "And your choice at the choosing was wrong, but it does not make you weak. It makes you human. And being human means you get to choose again." She lifted their joined hands. The golden light flared brighter, pushing the darkness back another foot. "Choose again," she said. "Right now, not out of duty, not out of guilt, not because the kingdom needs it. Choose me because I am worth choosing." The wasting surged. A wall of cold and darkness crashing toward them like a wave, and Seren felt it reach for every wound she had ever hidden, every night she had cried in the vault, every time she had made herself invisible because being seen felt too dangerous. She held her ground, she held his hand, she held the truth. Theron looked at her, in the fading light, his eyes were wet. "I choose you," he said. "Not for the kingdom, not for the covenant, for you. Because you stood in the back of a hall in a mended dress, and you were the bravest thing I had ever seen. Because you talk to flowers and leave seedlings at the doors of men who don't deserve them. Because you are the heart of everything, and I was too afraid to hold you." The golden light exploded. It poured from their joined hands, and from the bond itself, from the place in their chests where the tether connected them. It flooded the cavern, the bedrock, the deep places where the wasting lived, and everywhere the light touched, the darkness did not fight. It simply ceased. Because there was nothing left to feed it, no denial, no rejection, no small, frightened lies about unworthiness. Just two people standing in the dark, holding hands, telling the truth. The wasting dissolved like breath into winter air. The stone beneath their feet warmed. The deep places filled with light. Seren felt the covenant seal itself, not with force, not with magic, but with the quiet, irreversible certainty of two people who had finally stopped running from what they were. They woke in his chambers, wrapped in each other's arms, the morning light pouring through the windows in golden shafts. The fire had burned to embers. The runes in the walls still glowed faintly, warm and steady, like a pulse. Theron pulled her closer and buried his face in her hair, and she felt him shaking, not from cold, not from fear, from relief so vast it had nowhere to go but through his body in waves. "I've got you," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him. "I've got you." The kingdom did not heal overnight. The orchards needed tending. The fields needed replanting. The wells had to be cleared and the walls rebuilt, where the decay had done its worst. It was months of work, slow and exhausting and unglamorous, the kind of healing that happened, not in dramatic bursts of golden light, but in the patient daily effort of people who refused to give up. But the land responded. Not because of magic, not because of ancient covenants and mystical bonds, but because the woman who talked to flowers walked the fields every morning beside the man who had finally learned to listen. And wherever they went, together, the soil remembered what it was supposed to do. The court's reaction was complicated. As Corvin had predicted, a foundling, as the Alpha Queen, was not what anyone had envisioned. The whispers followed Saren through every corridor and every formal dinner, and she would be lying if she said they did not sting, but Theron was unwavering. At their bonding ceremony, held in the great hall where the floor had first glowed beneath her feet, he spoke his vows with a steadiness that silenced every skeptic in the room. "I chose wrong once," he said, his hand warm around hers, his gray eyes holding hers with a fierceness that made her breath catch. "I will spend the rest of my life choosing right." Vesna sent a letter from the Southern Territories. It was brief and characteristically pointed. She had negotiated a new trade alliance with the eastern provinces, secured a title of her own, and acquired an estate with exceptional gardens. She wished them well. She did not say she was happy, but between the lines, Saren thought she might be. Marin retired from the infirmary 6 months later, claiming her old bones had earned a rest. She moved into chambers in the royal wing, close enough that Saren could visit every evening. They drank tea together and argued about soil composition, and pretended they were not both getting misty-eyed about how far they had come. And in the mornings, Saren woke in the king's arms, in the king's bed, in the warm amber light of a kingdom that was alive, because two people had stopped pretending they did not need each other. She would watch him sleep sometimes, and remember the day she had crossed the great hall with an herb basket and a prayer to be invisible, and the floor had blazed golden beneath her feet, and the kingdom had reached for her before either of them understood why. His face was peaceful now, no shadows beneath his eyes, no tension in the line of his jaw, just rest, just warmth, just the quiet certainty of a man who had come home. Saren would press her lips to his shoulder, settle back against the pillow, and close her eyes. And beneath them, beneath the castle, beneath the kingdom itself, the land breathed and was whole.